Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting version of Chip Talks podcast. So, today we're going to talk about cellular metabolics and frequency. So, everybody's probably going, oh no, we're going to get sciencey. Oh no. Well, hopefully, I can put this in a context that you guys can understand. If I can't, then I'm not doing my job. Okay. So I want to really make this a really understandable podcast and video, audio, however you want to look at it. But we've got to dive into some rather detailed scientific concepts. Now, why are we doing this? Well, in almost every video that you or podcast that you hear me do, you're going to hear me talk about fasting and fed. You're going to hear me talk about omega-3, omega-6. You're going to hear me talk about the endocannabinoid system. You're going to hear me talk about a lot of these concepts that are, let's say, common across health, right? Well, why do I talk about them? Well, in order to understand that, we really have to dive deep into a cell, right? And what a cell wants. Now, here's the underpinning theory that I have, at least, is if I can figure out, let's say, how to make all your cells happy and healthy, then you're going to be one happy and healthy system of cells. So if I can make all your heart cells happy and healthy, then you're going to have one happy and healthy heart. If I can make all your nerve cells happy and healthy, then you're not going to have diabetes, neuropathy, seizures, things like that, right? So this is really important to understand at the cellular level what happens and kind of how, let's say, our behavior, our diet, our eating frequency, our allergies, our, do you work with lead or plutonium type behavior affect a cell? Because if we can understand this and we can eliminate variables and we can optimize, right? And that's what we want to do. We want to live as long as we possibly can. So we're talking about longevity and aging when we're talking about these concepts. And we're talking about good health when we're talking about these concepts. Okay. So let's dive in and let's talk a little bit about this. So what is the most important thing that a cell does? Probably produce energy, right? So without energy, a cell can't be alive. It can't perform any of its functions. It can't, build enzymes and proteins and things that we need to protect us. If it's an immune cell, it can't function. It can't help us. So producing energy is the most important thing that a cell does every single second. The second most important thing a cell does is defend itself. Okay. And this is why we talk so much about the immune system, because that's what you do. And the most important thing that you do as a system is defend yourself, right? Or second most important thing, producing energy and staying alive would be the most important thing. So just like we're a reflection, I guess is the best way to say it, of our cell. So our cell, we're trying to do the same thing our cells are trying to do: produce energy and stay alive, defend ourselves, and then ultimately reproduce, right? So those are really big key aspects of life. So how does a cell do this? Well, a cell produces something called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And adenosine triphosphate is, let's say, the gas inside of us. So that's a real energetic molecule where a lot of energy is stored. And then as we use that energy, we break that molecule down into something called ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and then AMP, adenosine monophosphate. But basically, we're losing phosphates in each one of those energetic conversions. So we're converting basically that bond, that phosphate bond, into energy. All right, so it's important to understand how much ATP that we make, and we make ATP in 4 different ways. Okay, so the most woohoo and most out there I'll talk about real quick, and then we'll leave that one alone. But we all know that plants photosynthesize, and so plants use light, they use sunlight to build ATP inside of themselves. And they'll do that at a certain rate, which is really cool. But plants will build ATP from the sun. Okay. And we do a little bit of that, but it's, that's still, let's say, new and too new to really talk about in too much depth right now. Although if you want to know about that, I'm happy to talk about that. So call me up. It's cool stuff. But the way that we're really designed to run is using beta oxidation, so oxygen and dietary fat. And that is the most efficient way for us to produce ATP. That is called beta oxidation. That's called aerobic, if you will, kind of activity by your muscles. So when you're using oxygen and fat to basically produce ATP. The lowest rate of energy production, but it actually happens the fastest, which is a little confusing, but it's the lowest rate of ATP production happens when we're just converting glucose into ATP. And that is what I call low gear. Okay. So if we're converting glucose to ATP, we do that at a rate of about 1 unit of glucose, and we'll make about 32, let's say, units of ATP. In high gear, when we're beta oxidizing, when we're burning fat, we'll take 1 unit of basically glucose is how it all starts, but it doesn't have to be glucose. It can be ketones, but we'll produce over 100 units of ATP in high gear. And this is super variable. Again, there's a lot of things that affect this, but just, we want to optimize. The big thing is that we want to optimize our high gear, right? We want to be in high gear as much as we possibly can. And this is why we talk about intermittent fasting so much, because again, what happens when we eat is we go into kind of this low gear where all of our mitochondria inside of every cell, for the most part, are basically producing ATP from sugars. And that's an inefficient state. About 5 hours after we eat, we pop up into this high gear where then our mitochondria are producing ATP from oxygen and from fats, dietary fats. And that's our most efficient way to run. Okay. But there's different rates of basically this ATP production, which is, energy for us. And so we want to be making ATP as quick, as fast, and as efficiently as we possibly can in order to fuel ourselves. Now, there is let's say, a fourth state of metabolics, and that is something called the Warburg state. And this is what a lot of cancers like to get into, but this is the most inefficient way to produce energy. It's a 1 to 2. So you take 1 unit of glucose, you produce 2 units of ATP. And that is extraordinarily inefficient, but cancers do it really fast. So they're able to basically turn over ATP really fast, and they use this to grow really rapidly. And this is why cancers have such a rapid growth profile, is because they produce ATP so rapidly, although it's super inefficient. So let's say, if you look at cancer versus a normal cell, 1 unit of glucose in cancer is going to produce 2 units of ATP. Even in low gear, 1 unit of glucose will produce 32 units of ATP. So even in our, let's say, least efficient way to run, we're still about 16 times more efficient in producing ATP than cancer is. Okay. So why does all this matter? So that's really interesting. And hopefully you're getting it that, when we talk about fasting and fed and things like that, this really goes all the way back to the mitochondria inside of every cell, and how basically you're, telling them produce energy in this way or produce energy in another way by our behavior. Okay. So when we eat, we're putting them all in low gear, and, we need to nutrient ourselves. So we need to have times when we eat, but that's, not optimal, right? So we don't want to run. We want to really figure out how to optimize our high gear. Okay. So inside of every cell, there might be hundreds, if not thousands, of mitochondria. And they're producing basically ATP at a certain rate. Okay. That rate, so each mitochondria maybe can produce, 500 or 600 per second, ATP. But when you combine and network all those mitochondria together within a cell, now you have a powerful network that can produce ATP up into the gigahertz range. Okay. So inside of every cell, you have basically a frequency generator that's generating frequency up in the gigahertz range. Any engineers out there? Any electrical engineers? What does that mean to you? You've got a whole lot of power inside of every single cell. You've got a microwave inside of every cell. You're basically producing energy at the same rate that a microwave produces energy. So that is a lot of power and a lot of energy. And why do you need that much power and energy? Well, a cell's got to do a lot of work on the inside of it, right? It's got to basically express DNA. It's got to, on the one hand, very physically deal with that DNA. On the other hand, very frequency deal with that DNA, which we're going to talk about in a second. But a cell's got to do a lot of work, right? So it's got to do a lot of work. Now, again, you're producing ATP at a couple of orders of magnitude less than the frequency of the sun. That is some serious power inside of every cell. Okay. So, what do we do with this sun like power inside of every cell? Well, it turns out that frequency is useful. And certainly this frequency, this power is what produces, our ability to generate ligands and express receptors and build an immune response and do all those things that a cell wants to do. But let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. Okay. So our understanding right now of, let's say, how a cell works, and, a cell is trying to do work, right? So a cell needs to defend, needs to produce energy, needs to defend itself. And then kind of the third thing it needs to do is do its work, right? Whatever work it's supposed to do. And that work almost always involves proteins, building proteins. So certain cells need to build certain types of proteins, and they will under certain stimulus. But how those proteins get built is based on that stimulus, the cell understanding a stimulus, and then a cell expressing. And what do I mean by expressing? I mean kind of unwinding certain areas of DNA. And then our current understanding is that this little reader, a kind of a reader, comes along and reads that DNA. And as it's reading it, it's building a little protein chain. So that reader is called RNA polymerase. And the protein chain it builds is the thing that the cell's trying to express. And that little protein chain will go through a couple of steps, and then it will get expressed. And so that protein might be expressed inside the cell, or it might be expressed outside the cell. It might be a signaling protein, or it might be something that cell feels like it needs to glue onto itself or inside of itself for certain reasons. So that's our current understanding of how a cell works. Well, now let's go back to our kind of new understanding of the rate at which a cell is making ATP, which is an incredibly high frequency, which is a lot of power. What do we do with all this power? Well, it turns out DNA is also an antenna. So as that DNA expresses, as it kind of unfolds, it can also get adducted, so it can get stuff stuck to it, but it becomes a fractal antenna. And again, this is somewhat theory, but that likely has the same dynamics as it does physically. So again, that frequency that would be associated with that DNA would be the same as it's the same protein that it's trying to express. But basically what I'm saying is a cell is like a bell, okay? A cell is like a bell. And you have an intense ringing inside of that cell all the time. You have ATP being produced at a very, very high rate. So you have a lot of power, but you have an intense ringing inside of that cell bell, let's say. And then cells will express things called receptors, right? And it takes some stimulus. So a cell needs to understand, oh, no, I have a pathogen. I need to express certain things to help me kill that pathogen or defend against that pathogen. Cells understand, environment, and we have environmental sensors that communicate with cells. So depending on the stimulus a cell receives, it will do different things. But again, a cell is singing this song like a bell on the inside of it, and it will express receptors based on that stimulus. Another name for a cellular receptor is a transducer. Have any electrical engineers out there? What does a transducer do? It converts energy, right? From one form to another or from one frequency to another. And that's exactly what receptors do. So they'll take that high frequency that's being generated inside of a cell and they will convert it to whatever frequency they're trying to convert it to. So, like a CB1 neuroreceptor, which is expressed in almost, well, in every cell and not just every cell on mitochondria. So he will have a certain frequency associated with him that he will sing at. And depending on the power, he could, sing across your body or he could sing to a buddy right next to him. But receptors basically are another way for cells to express certain frequencies depending on the makeup of that receptor. Okay. Isn't that cool? Now, if you guys want substance for this, there's a thing called the resonant recognition model of physics, really penned by someone named Irina Kosak. So you can go look up the resonant recognition model of physics if you want more information. But here's a test that they did, which is really cool. And again, what does this mean? Well, it means, the way that we're taught about how cells work is we, express proteins and those proteins do work. Well, that absolutely happens. But it's looking like that's sort of one end of a continuum. So yeah, you can run that way, but you can also run in a way where you run in frequency. And so what this resonant recognition model of physics has found out, and I'll use COVID as an example. So we're all quite familiar with COVID, I'm sure. But the way that COVID gets in us is in our respiratory system, we have receptors that are expressed called ACE2 neuroreceptors. Okay. So again, this is a cell expressing a receptor called ACE2 that's going to theoretically operate at a certain frequency, right? And so that's what happens inside of our respiratory. Now, COVID wants to enter us through those ACE2 neuroreceptors. So COVID will find those receptors and enter through those receptors. Well, it turns out there's certain things that block those receptors, like licorice and like several things in cannabis, CBDA, THCA, CBGA, will all block the ACE2 neuroreceptor. All right. Is that beneficial for COVID? Yes, absolutely. That's preventative and it will, keep you from getting COVID, or if you have COVID, it will keep it from getting worse. So we know this. And again, there's lots of, let's say, data and research, indicating that if you block ACE2, that's going to be preventative against COVID or prophylactic against COVID. Well, what these resonant recognition model of physics people wanted to do is, well, could we do that same thing in frequency? And it turns out that the ACE2 neuroreceptor has a certain frequency, and things that want to dock with that neuroreceptor have the same frequency. They're just phase shifted. Okay. So you basically have frequency looking for frequency inside of your body in order to dock. Now, what they did was they were able to block ACE2 in frequency, and that was COVID preventative, which is really cool. But what does all this mean? Well, it's just proof of what I'm telling you is that inside of a cell, you're producing ATP at a certain rate that produces a very strong frequency that's a lot of power. And then cells will express receptors or transducers in order to sing a song, right? And they will sing that song across your body, or they'll sing that song to their neighbors and buddies right next door. It's important to understand, though, that this all takes power. And the way that you generate the most power is beta oxidation, is that's how you produce the most ATP. And again, the way that you control that is by fasting. When you eat, you go into a lessened state. Okay. And so just important to remember why we kind of harp on these concepts. So you'll hear me harp on intermittent fasting. You'll hear me harp on omega-3, omega-6. Why does omega-3, omega-6 matter? It's how cell walls are built. It's, again, the two most important foods that you eat every day. And again, mitochondria are running on dietary fats. And polyunsaturated fats produce more energy. They've got stronger bonds. And so omega-3 and omega-6 are polyunsaturated fats, which are better fuel, but your body uses them in lots of other ways other than fuel. But that's why we come back to these concepts all the time. Okay, so let's kind of wrap it up here. We produce, the most important thing that we produce at the cellular level is ATP, which is energy, right? In order to produce energy, we can produce energy in different ways. We have a low way to produce energy, which is with glucose. We have a higher way to produce energy, which is with dietary fats. Under dietary fats and under our high rate of ATP production, we have a higher frequency inside of a cell. So we have more power to do things inside of that cell, to sing songs, to defend itself, to do whatever that cell is trying to do. Now, in order for us to, let's say, live longer, we all want to live longer. We all want to live healthier. We all want to, be at our best, our optimized best. Well, in order to do that, we have to understand these principles. And again, how could I wreck this energy thing inside of you? Have you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then feed you the wrong kind of fats? And good luck. You'll never be efficient. You'll never get to, let's say, you'll never be all that you can be. You'll never live as long as you could live. You'll never be as healthy as you could possibly be because you're not optimizing your system. So what we try to do at True Medics and Chip Talks is really help you understand how to optimize your system. But it all starts with a cell, and we've got to understand what's going on with a cell in order to understand kind of what's going on bigger picture. And if we can optimize a cell, we can optimize you. I've said for a long time that I think mitochondria, at least as to health, mitochondria are the philosopher's stone. So if we study and really understand what a mitochondria wants and needs and its interactions with the cell that houses it, we are going to find a next level, a next gear in our health. We're going to live a lot longer. We're going to be a lot healthier. We're not going to have a lot of the issues that we have now. So that's why it's so important to talk about these concepts and so important to somewhat glaze your eyes with science. But hopefully, my job is to make this understandable for you guys. My job is to make it where it doesn't glaze your eyes and where you quickly understand, and, where we could teach a third grader, let's say, these same concepts, because we need to. Again, a third grader needs these concepts, at least at the basic level. No one ever gave me an operations manual for, this thing that I drive every day. And so all we're trying to do is help you understand and build the operations manual for you. All right, we'll leave it there for now. We'll see you guys back next week for another exciting version of Chip Talks Health. Bye.